Hello, and welcome back to Easy High School Physiology. This is Dave, and we are embarking on Module 17 on diseases. Excuse me. I've divided the area into three parts. Part one, we're going to take a look at chronic diseases. Those are diseases that involve the malfunction or breakdown of body organs. They do not involve germs, no germs at all. We'll take a close look at diabetes in this first part. In the second part about diseases, we'll go into infectious diseases, those that are caused by germs, and we'll take a look at the various kinds of germs, their life cycles, how they're transmitted, and how we can control them. In the third part of the infectious diseases, we're going to look at viruses and bacterial diseases, body defenses, vaccines, antibodies, and antibiotics, among other things. So I think you'll enjoy this. It's quite practical, and there's a lot of science to it. So let's get started. Like I said, I've divided this area into chronic diseases and infectious diseases. Now, the word chronic comes from a Greek word chronos, meaning time. So chronic diseases usually last a long time, many months or many years, and they're quite prevalent in older people. Infectious diseases usually don't last very long. Either you recover from a germ disease or it gets worse and you go toward death. But infectious diseases are definitely caused by germs. Chronic diseases are not. They're a breakdown of the body. Okay, and today we're going to be looking at chronic diseases. To give you an idea of the kinds of infectious diseases that we'll look at in our next module, these are all caused by germs, and you might be familiar with them. Common cold, the flu, COVID, measles, polio, and tuberculosis, all caused by either viruses or bacteria. But today, we're going to be taking a look at these. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. We're going to be taking a look at asthma, emphysema, heart disease, stroke, hypertension or high blood pressure, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, arthritis, obesity, and diabetes. Those are the ones we'll be looking at today. All right. Some of these we have covered a little bit in previous modules, but today I'm lumping them all together under chronic diseases. The first one that we're going to take a look at has to do with the respiratory system. And as you can see, we're going to be talking about asthma and emphysema, both having to do with the respiratory system. As you can see, here's our trachea coming down, the left bronchus and the right bronchus, and then the lungs subdivide down into small tubes called bronchioles. And it's the bronchioles that are the problem in asthma. Let's take another look here. As we follow one of the bronchioles down in the lungs, here's a bronchiole right here. It's only 1 millimeter across, as you recall. And in asthmatics, what happens is the person breathes in something that sets off the bronchiole that goes into quivering like this, like that. And when the bronchiole quivers like that, the air can't get through. The bronchiole actually closes down a little bit, and the air can't get through to go down to the air sacs, so it's very difficult breathing. Again, this would be caused by breathing in dust or something you're allergic to, uh, something in the air. That's why asthmatics have to be very careful where they live, how they breathe, to avoid having that kind of irritation to the bronchiole. Now, with emphysema, it's a little bit different situation. Emphysema uh, involves the air sacs down here, the alveoli, as we've discussed before in Module 4. This is where the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place in the air sac or the alveolus. And what happens in emphysema, especially a person who's been smoking a lot most of their lives, or are working in a industrial area that has a lot of pollutants in the air, what happens is these air sacs the walls of the air sacs will become stiffened and thick, and then the oxygen and the CO2 cannot diffuse through the walls of the air sac easily. And this is called emphysema, and obviously these people have difficulty breathing because the oxygen is not diffusing into the bloodstream like it should. Okay, very good. So there's asthma and emphysema. Next one we're going to be taking a look at is heart disease. And here's a little reminder of where the heart is. Heart is right in the center of the chest. Here's the left lung and the right lung. Here's the breathing muscle, the diaphragm. And there's the heart, right pretty much in the center. When you have heart disease, what happens is these blood vessels that feed the heart itself become clogged with fatty deposits. And if that happens, then blood cannot reach further down to where it needs to go, and that part of the heart will die. It can cause either a heart attack or a cardiac arrest. In heart attack, the heart is still beating, but it's not beating very well. It's kind of like this. In a cardiac arrest, the heart actually stops. So this is why these blood vessels in the heart are so important, and diet and exercise and other factors have a lot to do with preventing this kind of heart disease. Another picture I have here, maybe a little bit better one, shows those called coronary blood vessels, the arteries, again feeding the heart itself, and if they get blocked for some reason, they can cause a heart attack. By the way, we know that about 16 million people have heart disease in the United States today. And I forgot to mention that with asthma, there are 26 million asthmatics in the United States, and there are 14 million people suffering from emphysema. I'm sorry I forgot to mention those numbers when we looked at those pictures. Okay, so that's heart disease. The next disease we're going to be taking a look at is stroke. And here's a picture from Module 7 having to do with blood vessels. And we can see here the arteries are bringing blood from the heart up to the brain. And if any one of these arteries in the brain becomes clogged up or blocked, then that section of the brain dies, just like kind of a heart attack of the brain. And this would cause a stroke. If the stroke is caused in a motor area, then part of the body will be paralyzed. And if the stroke is caused in a sensory area, then that part of the body will lack sensation. Okay? All right, so that's stroke. What else can we say about stroke? About 800,000 people are stroke victims still living today. And like I said, you lose either motor control or sensation if you have a stroke. All right. The next chronic disease we're going to look at is called hypertension. Hyper means too much, tension means kind of tense. so you're tense all the time. And it's high blood pressure. We looked at this also in Module 7, as you recall, and here we see the blood flowing down an artery, and the pushing of the blood against the walls of the artery is what blood pressure is. It's good to have normal blood pressure because that means the blood is flowing correctly. But if the pressure is too high, then this force against the walls of the artery weaken those walls. And also, it makes the heart work harder to push the blood through because of the kind of a backflow. So hypertension or high blood pressure is very serious, and it should be taken care of. We know that today around about 116 million Americans have high blood pressure. That's about 47% of the population. And fortunately, there are medicines that can lower the blood pressure, and of course, exercise and a good diet helps also. The next chronic disease we're going to be taking a look at is Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is a disease of the nervous system that sometimes results in a tremor like this, a tremor in the fingers or the hands. The origin of the Parkinson's disease is partly in the medulla, partly the pons, and partly the cerebellum right here, all having to do with movement. And we might be able to see a little bit better in this picture here that we've used before. This is from Module 15, and here we see a side view of the brain, and we see the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum right here. This area is affected in Parkinson's disease. It's a degeneration of the neurons in those areas, resulting in tremors, rigidity, and difficulty walking. Okay. All right, very good. All right, let's take a look at the next disease, and that's Alzheimer's disease, primarily a disease of old people. And again, that involves the brain. Now, in Alzheimer's disease, by the way, this comes from the Module 14, where we looked at the brain. It's primarily a disease of the memory, not long-term memory. People with Alzheimer's can remember their childhood, but they can't remember what they did a half hour ago. And that causes them to feel helpless and become confused, and it's a very difficult disease. Okay, lack of recent memory. The area of the brain is right in here, the memory area in the temporal lobe of the brain that we've discussed before. Okay. Now we're going to take a look at arthritis. Arthritis is a disease of the joints, usually of the hands or the wrists or the elbow, but it could be the knees or other areas of the body. And what happens is that the joints become inflamed. Some researchers think it's the body attacking itself. Others are not so sure. But the joints become inflamed, they become painful, and in some people, their fingers end up kind of like this because it's difficult for them to move those joints. All right? It's commonly found in the wrists and the fingers, as we can see here. Okay. And it might be found in the knee joint that we see here. Here we see two parts. We see the femur coming down to the tibia here. I know we haven't had this module yet, but we will very soon. There's a layer, there's a layer right here that protects the two bones from rubbing up against each other. And if that layer becomes too shallow or too narrow, then these bones might be working up against each other, and that can also cause inflammation and pain. So in arthritis, we're talking about 27 million Americans suffering from that. There's some relief from pain relievers, and otherwise it's good to sort of move those joints as much as possible and get some relief that way. Now we're going to be taking a look at something called obesity. Obesity is something that's become very prevalent in the U.S. in the last 20 or 30 years, and a lot of scientists are quite worried about it, that other diseases are going to stem from obesity. For example, obesity can lead to more incidence of heart disease, diabetes, and stroke. So it's not to be taken lightly. I've put together kind of some information here about how to figure out if you or one of your friends or family members is obese. And the idea is called the body mass index, okay? This is a ratio of your weight to your height. Your weight to your height. And it's in the metric system, so the weight has to be expressed in kilograms, and the height has to be expressed in centimeters converted to meters. Anyway, I'm going to walk you through an example here. We're going to take a person who, here's the ratio, weight in kilograms divided by the height in meters, quantity squared. Okay, we're going to take an example of a person weighing 220 pounds and is 5 foot 9 inches tall. Okay, now the next thing we have to do is change the pounds into kilograms, and you do that dividing by 2.2 pounds, because there's 2.2 pounds in a kilogram. So 220 divided by 2.2 equals 100 kilograms. This 220 pound person weighs 100 kilograms. So we got the first part up here. Now we need to figure out the height. This person is 5 foot 9 inches tall, which comes out to 69 inches. We need to change that to centimeters. There's 2.54 centimeters in an inch. So we multiply 69 by 2.54, and that gives us 175 centimeters. We need to change that to meters, so just divide by 100, and we get 1.75 meters. Okay? So now we have the bottom part. We have to take that 1.75 meters and square it. If we do, we get 3 meters squared. So now we have the bottom part of the ratio. Dividing the 100 kilograms by 3 square meters gives us 33. All right, now what does that 33 mean? Well, let's take a look. Oh, this is just a ratio. The numbers have no real value. If the ratio comes out somewhere between 20 and 25, then that's good. That's a pretty normal weight. All right. If it comes out between 20 and 30, then you regard it as overweight. But if it's 30 or above, 31 or above, now you're called obese. This is what's been set up to decide who's obese and who's not. So, in our example back here, as you recall, we came up with 33 for this 220-pound, 5 foot 9 person. Would he be obese? Yes, he would, because he's 33. All right. Anyway, you can try this on yourself, your friends, and your family, and see what their index is, body mass index. We're going to be taking a look now at diabetes. It's a very common problem, common disease. about 1.3 million Americans have diabetes. I'm talking about type 1 diabetes. They've divided it into type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is more serious because you have to take insulin every day. Okay? Type 2 we're going to talk about in a few minutes. All right. By the way, I have a family member who has diabetes, and I know a couple of people who have diabetes. So it's very likely that if you look around your own family or friends, you'll find at least one person who needs insulin every day for their diabetes. So what is diabetes? Diabetes is basically a lack of insulin. As you recall, when we studied the digestive system, we took a look at the pancreas, which we will in a few minutes, and we saw that one of the functions of the pancreas is to release insulin into the bloodstream, but we didn't say exactly why, and we're going to go into why right now. The pancreas releases a hormone called insulin into the bloodstream, and without this, you are in trouble. Without this, you have diabetes. Okay? So let's take a look. Where is the pancreas anyway? Let's see. Here we go. We've seen this picture before in Module 2 about the digestive system. Here's the esophagus, the stomach, liver, small intestines, large intestines. And as the stomach empties, it empties into the duodenum, as you recall. Right here's the duodenum. And right adjacent to the duodenum, and even attached to the duodenum, is the pancreas, right here. All right? So that gives you an idea where it is. Even a better picture is right here. Here we see, here's the duodenum, beginning of the small intestines, and here's the pancreas coming right here. Now, let's review. Part of the pancreas is digestive, so it releases juices into the duodenum that helps to digest carbohydrates and fats. Okay. The other function that the pancreas has is to release the hormone insulin directly into the bloodstream to help, well, we'll see in a minute what it's going to do. But that insulin must go into the bloodstream directly, and it does. Okay. Now you know that as the carbohydrates come down here through the small intestine, eventually they're broken down into glucose. You recall that from our digestive system, glucose. And glucose is a sugar which contains lots of energy. And that's what the cells need, the energy in glucose. I've drawn a little diagram here to help explain how the glucose works here. Here's a Here's a blood vessel. It would be a capillary in this case. Here's glucose molecules. I've just represented that by the letter G. They're coming down here. They're full of energy because they're a sugar, and they need to get out here into the body cells. I've represented these as body cells. So what the glucose would do is to diffuse through the wall of the capillary into the extracellular fluid, and then diffuse through the cell membrane here into the cell, where the cell can use the energy inside the glucose. Now the problem is, it's very hard for the glucose to get through the cell membrane. Very difficult, all right? Fortunately, Mother Nature has figured this problem out, and this is what happens. Let's say you eat a donut, okay? A nice donut full of sugar, all right? And after about 20 minutes or so, that donut is, well, a little bit longer than that. That donut is digested, it enters your small intestines, and it's by that time that donut has turned into glucose, and the glucose is now in your bloodstream. And because glucose is a sugar, we say you have a high blood sugar level. You've probably heard that before. High blood sugar level. When the pancreas detects this high blood sugar level of glucose, it secretes the insulin into the bloodstream. So we have insulin and glucose together in the bloodstream. When the glucose leaves the capillary and enters the extracellular fluid on its way out to the cells, the insulin goes along with it. And when they arrive at the membrane to go through into the cell, the insulin and the glucose combine together, and that helps the glucose go through the cell membrane into the cell where the energy in the glucose can be used by the cell. Okay, that's basically it. So without the insulin, the glucose has a very hard time getting inside the cell. That's basically what diabetes is. And that's why diabetics of type 1 diabetics who are insulin dependent have to take insulin every day, usually by injection, but maybe sometimes orally, I'm not sure. But I have a family member who's had to take injections all of her life, and it just became a way of life. Okay, now here's something interesting. I'm going to have you out there in viewer land be the doctor, all right? And I'm going to guide you through what the symptoms of a diabetic would be if you were the doctor and a person came into your office and the person gave you 5 symptoms, 5 signs, and you as the doctor would say, aha, you have diabetes, all right? So let's figure out what those symptoms are, okay? And when we get through with this, you're going to see how easy this is, all right? Now, we're talking about a diabetic person who is not taking insulin. They don't know they have the disease yet, but they're suffering from some symptoms, so they go to the doctor, all right? Now, if there's no insulin in this person, and this glucose is trying to get inside the cell and can't get in, and the glucose contains energy, do you think this person is going to be full of energy or tired and fatigued all the time? Okay, if you said tired and fatigued, you're right, because this energy of glucose is not getting into the cell. Okay, that's the first symptom. Let's look at the second symptom. If the glucose is not getting into the cell, then it's going to back up into the bloodstream, all right? And you're going to have a high amount of glucose in the bloodstream. When this glucose gets through your kidneys, the kidneys are going to say, aha, there's too much glucose, and the kidneys are going to do what? Take it out, take the glucose out, and put it in the urine. So this person is going to be peeing a lot. Why? Because the kidneys are saying, we've got to get rid of this glucose. It's too much. We can't take it. And so the person reporting to the doctor will say, doctor, I'm just peeing all the time. The doctor says, okay. Let's look at the next symptom now. If this person, the third symptom, if this person is peeing all the time, that means water is leaving his body. How do you think do you think he's going to feel thirsty or not? Yeah, he's going to be thirsty all the time. That's the third symptom, is thirst. Okay? All right. Let's look at the fourth symptom now. Okay? If that glucose is not getting into the body cells, do you think this person is going to be hungry or satisfied? Well, even though they ate the donut, they're not getting the benefit of the donut, so they're going to feel hungry. That's the fourth symptom. Okay? Let's look at symptom number 5 now. If the glucose is not getting into the cell and it's backing up, the glucose is backing up, and the glucose is being peed out in the urine, all right, what do you think the urine is going to smell like or taste like? Because in the old days, back in the 1800s, doctors would check for diabetes by putting their finger in the person's urine and taking a little taste, all right? What do you think they were tasting for? How sweet it was, because this is sugar, right? So if a person's urine tasted sweet, that's another sign that glucose was being peed out in the urine, and this person had diabetes. All right. So let's summarize these symptoms of diabetes. All right. Lack of energy because the glucose is not getting into the cells. Hungry all the time for the same reason. Peeing a lot because the glucose is backing up into the bloodstream and the kidneys are peeing that glucose out. Thirsty all the time because water is leaving the body in the urine. And finally, the urine itself is sweet, either to the smell or usually to the taste. These days, of course, we do take it to a lab, and they do a lab analysis. But in the old days, doctors would actually do a little taste test. Okay. So when you eat that donut, and the donut is changed into glucose, the pancreas has to secrete an exact amount of glucose that will handle, the exact amount of insulin that will handle that glucose. It's very important that you don't have too much more insulin than you have glucose, or more glucose than you have insulin. This balance has to be maintained, and the pancreas does that. Okay? Now, let's look at a type 1 diabetic person who has to take insulin shots every day. Okay? Let's see what could go wrong with them. Now, a person with diabetes, type 1 diabetes, when they get up in the morning, they have to have a breakfast, of course, and then they have to take their insulin shot to exactly balance the glucose that was in that breakfast. Okay? But let's say they're irresponsible or they just forget, and they eat a couple of donuts, but they don't take their insulin. Okay, what's going to happen? Well, they have develop something called hyperglycemia. Hyper means too much. Gly refers to glucose. So this person has too much glucose in the bloodstream, and because they didn't take their insulin, they have no insulin at all in the bloodstream. Okay? Hyperglycemia, also called diabetic coma. Okay? And what can happen is this person can develop a headache, nausea, vomiting, deep breathing, deep fast breathing, confusion, and eventually coma if they don't get that insulin shot to counteract all that glucose that they just ate. All right? On the other hand, let's say the opposite happens. They get up in the morning and they say, oh, I'm going to take my shot. And they take their insulin shot, but then they have to rush off to work and they forget to eat breakfast. Now they have hypoglycemia. Now they have too much insulin in their body and not enough glucose to handle that insulin. Okay? This is hypoglycemia, not enough glucose. Okay? This is also called insulin shock. This person will soon be sweating, become dizzy, irritable, irrational behavior, seizures, and finally even coma. All right. So these are very dangerous situations, and this is why type 1 diabetics have to be very, very careful of what they eat and in taking their insulin. Okay. The last thing I want to go over is something called type 2 diabetes. This is something, by the way, when we talk about diabetes, I did mention there are 1.3 million type 1 diabetics, that means dependent on insulin, but there are 21 million type 2 diabetics. All right. Now, where do these type 2 diabetics come from? Well, They don't have those 5 symptoms that we just looked at. But what they do have in type 2 diabetes is an elevated blood sugar level. When they go to the hospital and the lab takes some of their blood and they analyze it, the sugar in the blood is higher than it should be. Not enough to become diabetes, but sort of pre-diabetes. And they call this type 2 instead of type 1. Okay? So they do this through a lab test. They find out that your blood sugar level is a little bit on the high side, and they're not going to give you insulin yet, but they are going to say control your diet better, exercise, and lose some weight, and it'll probably bring your blood sugar level down. So that's what they call type 2 diabetes. And with that, we're going to bring this part 1 to a close. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you come back to part 2 and 3 of diseases when we go more into the germs part of disease. And I look forward to having you then. This is Dave saying goodbye.